For 20 years, the valley knew her only by a cruelty, the too-fat widow of Barren Creek. It was a name carved from grief and stone, a wall she had built around a heart that had stopped beating the day she buried her husband, Elias, and the tiny, stillborn son who followed him into the cold earth. Ilara's world had shrunk to the boundaries of her homestead, a lonely speck against the vast, unforgiving canvas of the high plains. Her size, once a source of soft comfort for Elias, had become a target for the whispers of the town folk she never saw, a physical manifestation of the immovable sorrow that anchored her to this place. She worked the land with a grim, silent efficiency, her days measured not in hours but in chores. The sun rose, she fed the chickens. The sun set, she bolted the door. The seasons turned, and Ilara remained. Her life was a long, flat line of existence, a silent testament to endurance without purpose. Then came the storm. It was a living thing, a shrieking beast of wind and rain that clawed at the roof and threw itself against the sturdy oak door. The world outside was a churning chaos of mud and darkness. Inside, Ilara sat by the hearth, the firelight casting a lonely glow on her broad, impassive face. The flames were her only companion, their dance the only movement in the quiet cabin. It was then she heard it, a sound almost lost in the gale, a frantic, desperate knocking. It was not the knock of a neighbor, no one had come to her door in a decade. It was the sound of something small and breakable seeking refuge from the world's rage. Ilara did not move. Grief had made her selfish. Her solitude was a fragile piece she guarded jealously. The knocking came again, louder this time, punctuated by a thin, wavering cry that the wind could not entirely swallow. A child's cry. A knot of irritation tightened in her chest, but beneath it, something else stirred. A ghost of an echo from a life she had long since buried. With a heavy sigh that seemed to pull all the air from the room, she rose. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the floorboards groaning under her weight. She unbolted the door, pulling it inward against the storm's fury. The wind screamed into the cabin, guttering the lamp. And there on her stoop, huddled together like a litter of stray pups, were 7 children. They were drenched and shivering, their faces pale and streaked with mud in the flickering light. The oldest, a boy of no more than 14, stood at the front, his arms spread as if to shield the smaller ones behind him. His eyes, wide with a fear that was older than his years, met hers. He held a sleeping toddler in one arm, a sack of something meager in the other. 6 other pairs of eyes stared up at her, a constellation of terror and desperate hope. "State your business." Ilara's voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse. The boy swallowed, his jaw tight. "Shelter. Just for the night." The storm, his voice cracked, and he didn't finish. Ilara's gaze swept over them, seeing the bare feet, the threadbare clothes, the hollows in their cheeks. They were orphans, she knew it instantly. Runaways. Trouble. Every instinct screamed at her to shut the door, to preserve the sterile quiet of her world. "I have nothing for you," she said, her words as cold as the rain. But they did not move. The smallest one, a girl with hair like wet straw, began to cry, a thin, pitiful sound. The boy who led them simply stared at Ilara, his gaze unwavering, a silent plea that was more powerful than any words. He did not beg. He simply stood his ground, a small, defiant protector against the storm and the woman who was as unforgiving as the landscape. Ilara felt the cold seep into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She looked at their faces, and for the first time in 20 years, she saw something other than the reflection of her own loss. She saw life, fragile and fierce, trembling on her doorstep. With another sigh, deeper this time, she stepped back. "Get in. Before you drown." The first day was a trial of silence. The children huddled together near the fire, a single, multi-limbed creature that flinched whenever Ilara moved. They did not speak. They ate the thin stew she ladled into bowls with a desperate, silent speed, their eyes darting from their food to her and back again. When they were finished, the oldest boy, Finn, gathered the bowls without being asked, rinsing them in the basin with a practiced efficiency. He then directed the others, his commands issued in whispers and gestures, to find dry spots on the floor away from her chair. They were a disciplined unit, accustomed to hardship and invisibility. Elara watched them from the fortress of her armchair, a strange and unwelcome warmth spreading from the hearth through the crowded room. The cabin, which had felt vast and empty for 2 decades, now seemed impossibly small, filled with the sounds of soft breathing and the rustle of damp clothes. The silence was different now. It was not the hollow silence of her grief, but a fragile, tense silence, heavy with unspoken questions and fear. She did not offer comfort. Words of kindness were foreign on her tongue, and her hands, calloused and strong from farm work, had forgotten the language of gentle touch. She gave them blankets, old and rough, and pointed to the loft. "You sleep there," she grunted, and watched as they scurried up the ladder like frightened squirrels. That night, she lay in her own bed, the familiar weight of her quilt unable to settle the disturbance in her soul. She could hear them above, the occasional cough, a muffled sob. She had let the world in, and it was noisy and needy, and it breathed. The next morning, she awoke to the smell of wood smoke. Finn was already up, feeding logs into the fire with a careful hand. He had found the woodpile and the axe, and a neat stack of fresh kindling sat beside the hearth. He froze when he saw her watching, expecting a blow or a curse. Elara said nothing. She simply began her morning routine, moving around the boy as if he were another piece of furniture. But she left a pot of porridge simmering on the hearth, far more than she would ever eat herself. The slow thaw began not with a word, but with a gesture. The smallest girl, Isla, who had not made a sound since her arrival, crept from the pack and sat on the floor a few feet from Elara's chair. Elara was mending a harness, her large fingers surprisingly nimble. The girl watched, her head cocked. Then, with tiny, solemn movements, she began to mimic Elara's actions with a piece of loose twine, her small brow furrowed in concentration. Elara paused, her needle hovering. She looked at the child, at the fierce focus in those pale blue eyes. She felt a painful lurch in her chest, a door creaking open on a room she had sealed shut long ago. She did not smile, but she did not look away. She simply continued her work, and the silent child continued to mirror her, a quiet apprenticeship of the soul. The other children, emboldened by Isla's bravery, slowly began to occupy the space. They learned the rhythms of the homestead, helping with chores without prompting, their small hands eager to prove their worth. They pulled weeds, collected eggs, and scrubbed the floors until the pine boards shone. They were trying to earn their keep, to become something more than burdens. Elara accepted their labor without thanks, but each evening, the stew was a little thicker, and sometimes, a piece of dried apple would appear beside each bowl. She was feeding them, nourishing them back from the brink, and in doing so, she was unknowingly feeding a part of herself that had been starving for 20 years. The homestead settled into a new, fragile rhythm, a quiet melody composed of the chop of an axe, the lowing of the milk cow, and the soft patter of small feet. One afternoon, a sound long dead in the cabin was resurrected: laughter. 2 of the middle boys were chasing a chicken in the yard, their whoops of delight echoing against the grey barnwood. Elara, standing on the porch, froze at the sound. It was alien, yet achingly familiar. It did not sound like her own lost son's laughter, how could it, but it was the same language of joy. A pained, complex expression crossed her face before she smoothed it back into its customary mask of indifference. She turned and went inside, but she left the door ajar, letting the sound drift in. She began to teach them, not with gentle instruction, but with gruff commands. "This is nightshade. You eat it, you die," she said, holding up a toxic berry. "This is yarrow. It stops the bleeding." She showed Finn how to read the clouds, how to predict the weather by the ache in his bones. She taught a pair of the girls how to plait rushes into a sturdy basket. She was giving them the tools of survival, the knowledge she had hoarded for herself. She was arming them for a world she knew to be cruel, and in the act of teaching, she found a flicker of purpose. The wall of her solitude was crumbling, brick by silent brick. She found herself watching them, learning their names not just as labels but as identities. Liam, the dreamer who stared at the clouds. Sarah and Emily, the inseparable twins. Daniel, the mischievous one. Anisla, her little shadow, who one evening reached out and placed a small, smooth river stone into Ilara's large, open palm. Ilara closed her fingers around the stone. It was cool and solid. A gift. She looked at Isla, and for the first time, her lips trembled with the effort of a smile. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it was there. The harbinger of their fragile peace was a traveling peddler, a man named Jedediah who passed through the valley twice a year. He saw the children in the yard and his eyes widened. Heard tell the workhouse east of the mountains lost its whole flock, he said to Ilara, his voice low. A bad business. The man who runs it, Silas Blackwood, is a devil in gentleman's clothes. He's put a bounty on their heads. Calls them fugitives. Says they're his property. Ilara's blood ran cold. She looked at Finn, who was stacking wood nearby, his back suddenly ramrod straight. The laughter in the yard died. Fear, a cold, unfamiliar snake, slithered back into their sanctuary. Blackwood. The name hung in the air like poison. After the peddler left, a heavy silence fell once more. That night, Finn approached her as she sat by the fire. The other children were asleep in the loft, but he had waited. He will come for us, he said. It wasn't a question. He'll find us, let him. Ilara's voice was a low growl, more animal than human. Finn looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the harsh exterior, past the name the world had given her. He saw the mountain that stood between his family and the coming storm. Why? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why are you helping us? Ilara stared into the flames, the firelight dancing in her dark eyes. She thought of the silence, of the 20 years of dust and echoes. She thought of the laughter in the yard and the cool, smooth stone in her pocket. She did not have the words to explain the transformation happening inside her. So she said the only thing that felt true. This is my land. What is on it is mine to protect. The wind changed. It carried a different chill, a sharp edge that spoke of approaching winter and something more. The dog, a scruffy stray that had adopted the homestead, began to bark at the horizon, his hackles raised at something only he could sense. Ilara felt it too, a tightening in her gut, the old instinct of a protector awakening from a long slumber. She watched the long, empty road that led to her gate, her gaze sweeping the ridge line. She had stopped being the too fat widow, a passive monument to sorrow. She was becoming a watchman. The day Silas Blackwood arrived was unnervingly beautiful. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. It was a day for peace, which made the lone rider approaching on a tall black horse seem all the more sinister. He was a stark, dark figure against the landscape's beauty, a blot of ink on a clean page. Ilara saw him from the porch. She did not call the children. She did not run. She simply stood and waited, her large frame filling the doorway. The children, sensing the shift in the world's gravity, fell silent and crept behind her, their small hands clutching the rough fabric of her dress. She was a living wall, and they were the precious things she guarded. The rider stopped at the gate. Silas Blackwood was a lean, severe man with a face as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of flint. He wore fine, dark clothes that were out of place in this rugged land, a testament to his belief that the world was his to command. He dismounted with a fluid, predatory grace and walked toward the porch, his polished boots making no sound on the dusty earth. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, flickered over the children hiding behind Ilara before settling on her. A thin, cruel smile touched his lips. Well, well. The too fat widow of Barren Creek. I heard you'd taken in some stray livestock. His voice was cultured, smooth, but laced with a venom that was unmistakable. He was using the name to wound her, to diminish her, to remind her of her place as an outcast. But the name no longer had power. It was a skin she had already shed. They are not livestock, Ilara said, her voice calm and dangerously low. And this is private property. Blackwood chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. They are fugitives from the county workhouse. They are indentured. They are my property, by laws. He took a step closer, his smile widening. Now, step aside, madam. I have no quarrel with you. Give me the children, and I will be on my way. I might even forget to report you for harboring criminals. From behind her, Ilara felt a small hand, Isla's, slip into hers. The child's fingers were cold with fear, but her grip was firm. Ilara squeezed back, a silent promise. She looked at Blackwood, at his smug certainty, at the entitlement that dripped from him like poison. She saw in his eyes the kind of casual cruelty that broke things just to watch them shatter. No, she said. The word was not loud, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. It was the sound of a border being drawn, a line in the dust from which she would not retreat. Blackwood's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. I am not asking, he hissed. I am telling you. Give them to me. He reached out, his hand grasping for Finn, who was closest. Before his fingers could touch the boy, Ilara moved. She was not fast, but she was inexorable, like a landslide. She stepped in front of Finn, her body completely shielding him. Her sheer size, the thing for which she had been mocked and scorned, was now an impenetrable shield. You will not touch them, she said, and her voice held the rumble of thunder. You will leave this place. Now for a moment, they were locked in a stalemate. The cruel, wiry man and the immense, immovable woman. The embodiment of greed against the embodiment of protection. It was a battle not just for 7 children, but for the soul of the lonely cabin on Barren Creek. The air on the porch crackled with a tension thicker than the summer heat. Silas Blackwood stared at the woman before him, disbelief warring with fury in his cold eyes. He had broken defiant men and terrified women his entire life. He operated on the principle that all people had a price or a breaking point. Yet this woman, this rural recluse, showed neither fear nor greed. She simply stood, a great, silent mountain of resolve. You are making a grave mistake, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He took a step back, his hand drifting toward the riding crop tucked into his belt. It was a threat he had used on children 100 times, a symbol of his power. Ilara saw the movement. She did not flinch. Her eyes, dark and steady, held his. The only mistake, she replied, her voice as flat and hard as the packed earth beneath their feet, was you setting foot on my land. With a snarl of frustration, Blackwood ripped the crop from his belt. He lunged, not at Ilara, but past her, aiming a vicious swipe at Liam, the boy peeking out from behind her left side. It was a swift, cruel motion, meant to sow terror and chaos. But Ilara was ready. She had spent 20 years working this land, her body honed by hardship. Her strength was not the quick, wiry strength of a fighter, but the deep, rooted power of the earth itself. As the crop whistled through the air, she pivoted, her heavy body moving with a surprising, practiced grace. She did not try to block the blow. Instead, she caught Blackwood's extended wrist in her massive hand. His bones ground together under the sudden, crushing pressure. A choked cry of pain and shock escaped his lips. The riding crop clattered to the porch floor. I told you, Ilara said, her voice still unnervingly calm as she squeezed harder, her knuckles white. You will not touch them. Blackwood's face went pale, his arrogance dissolving into raw, panic pain. He tried to pull away, but it was like trying to escape a blacksmith's vice. He was trapped. He looked from her implacable face to the 7 pairs of eyes watching him, no longer with fear but with a dawning, fierce awe. He had lost. He had underestimated the protective fury of a heart reawakened. Let me go, he gasped, his voice thin and reedy. Ilara held his gaze for a long moment, letting the lesson sink in. Then, with a final, contemptuous shove, she released him. He stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, his face a mask of humiliation and agony. He scrambled for his horse, his fine clothes now covered in the dust of his defeat. He hauled himself into the saddle, his movements clumsy and pained. He cast one last look at the woman on the porch, a look of pure, impotent hatred. This isn't over, he spat. Ilara simply watched him, silent. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, a dark figure shrinking into the vast, indifferent landscape, his threat swallowed by the wind. The dust settled. The porch was quiet again. The only sound was the frantic beating of 8 hearts. Slowly, the children emerged from behind her. They looked at the discarded riding crop, then up at her. Finn bent down and picked it up, and with a strength that belied his years, he snapped the thin leather over his knee and threw the pieces into the dirt. Then, Isla, the silent one, let go of Ilara's hand, stepped forward, and wrapped her small arms around Ilara's leg, burying her face in the rough fabric of her dress. One by one, the other children followed, huddling against her, clinging to her, a silent, powerful affirmation. Ilara stood for a moment, rigid and unused to the touch. Then, slowly, hesitantly, her large arms came up and enveloped them all in a clumsy, all-encompassing embrace. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, welled in her eyes and traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. They were not tears of grief, but of a fierce, defiant, and overwhelming love. The too fat widow of Barren Creek was gone. In her place stood a mother. The valley did not forget the name overnight, but its meaning began to change. The story of Silas Blackwood's retreat, likely embellished by the peddler Jedediah on his travels, became a local legend. The too fat widow was no longer a name spoken with pity or scorn, but with a grudging, fearful respect. She was the woman who had faced down a devil and won. But on the homestead, the name was never spoken again. She was simply Ilara. And more often than not, she was Mama. The year that followed was one of transformation. The cabin, once a silent monument to loss, became a boisterous, thriving home. With Finn's help and the eager energy of 6 other sets of hands, Ilara expanded the garden until it overflowed with corn, beans, and squash. They built a new, sturdy extension onto the cabin, a bunk room for the boys, constructed from timber Ilara and Finn felled themselves. The silence was replaced by a constant, chaotic symphony of life, laughter echoing from the barn, arguments over chores, the nightly ritual of stories read by the firelight from one of Ilara's 2 precious books. Her voice, once rusty from disuse, grew strong and warm as she read the familiar words aloud. She taught them everything she knew. They learned to churn butter, to smoke meat for the winter, to read the stars. She learned from them, too. She learned the specific sound of each child's cry, the shape of their dreams, the fears they still held from their time with Blackwood. She learned to braid Sarah's hair and how to soothe Liam's nightmares. She learned that a heart, no matter how long it has been dormant, can grow to accommodate an infinite amount of love. Her physical size, once a source of shame, became a symbol of their safety and abundance. Her broad lap was large enough for 3 children at once. Her strong arms could carry 2 buckets of milk and still have the strength to lift a weeping toddler. Her home was filled with the smell of baking bread, a scent of comfort and plenty that chased the last ghosts from the corners. One evening in late autumn, a year after they had first stumbled onto her porch, they all sat outside, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple. The air was crisp with the promise of cold to come, but a fire roared in a stone pit they had built together. Isla, who now spoke in soft, thoughtful sentences, was curled against Ilara's side, tracing patterns on her calloused hand. Finn, now a tall and capable young man, sat on her other side, his gaze fixed on the horizon, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows where he belongs. Ilara looked at the faces around her, illuminated by the flickering flames. 7 children who had arrived as frightened, half-starved strays were now her family, bound to her not by blood, but by the stronger ties of shared hardship and defiant love. They had saved her, just as surely as she had saved them. They had knocked on the door of her grief and demanded that she live again. A soft smile touched her lips, a gesture that was now as natural to her as breathing. The valley could call her whatever it wished. She knew who she was. She was the woman who had built a fortress of love on Barren Creek. She was home.